Flames danced in Pearl Riley's eyes as she tossed another canvas onto the growing bonfire, her trembling hands stained with the same oils and pigments that now curled and blackened in the hungry fire. Behind her small cabin on the outskirts of Central City, Colorado, the evening sky bloomed into a painting far more magnificent than any she had ever created. Vibrant streaks of orange and crimson stretching across the darkening blue canvas of dusk in the autumn of 1876. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over the crackle of the fire and her own stifled sobs. Pearl grabbed another painting from the stack beside her, this one, a landscape of the mountains that cupped the mining town like protective hands, and raised it to feed the flames. "Hold on there." The deep voice startled her so badly she nearly stumbled into the fire. "What in tarnation are you doing, madam?" Pearl whirled around, clutching the painting to her chest. A man sat atop a chestnut gelding, his face shadowed by the brim of a well-worn hat. The dying sunlight caught the silver of his spurs and the badge pinned to his leather vest. "This is private property," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "And what I do with my own work is none of your concern, deputy." The man swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. As he stepped closer, Pearl could see his features more clearly, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "Marshal," he corrected gently. "Marshal Mason Lane, and I'd say it becomes my concern when I ride by and see what looks like a cabin about to catch fire." His gaze moved from her face to the painting she still clutched. "That's mighty fine work you're burning." Pearl's fingers tightened around the wooden frame. "It's worthless. Mind if I take a look before you decide that for sure?" He extended a hand, not grabbing for the painting but waiting, palm up, with unexpected patience. Something in his steady gaze made Pearl hesitate. After a moment, she reluctantly handed over the canvas. Mason studied the painting with an intensity that made Pearl uncomfortable. It depicted the view from her cabin's porch, the rolling hills giving way to mountains, a lone eagle soaring above the pines, and the sprawling town nestled in the valley below. The way he looked at it, like he was seeing something valuable, made her want to snatch it back and throw it into the flames. "This is Central City, but not like I've ever seen it," he said finally. "You've made it beautiful." Pearl laughed bitterly. "Then I've lied with my brush. There's nothing beautiful about this place." Mason looked up from the painting, his eyes searching her face. "I reckon beauty's where you find it." He glanced back at the fire, where the edges of burned canvases curled like dying flowers. "Mind telling me why you're destroying all this?" Pearl turned away, watching the flames consume what had once been her dreams. "Because Daniel Blackwell said they were worthless, and he would know. He owns the biggest gallery in Denver." Her voice cracked. "He said I had no talent, no vision, and that no one would ever pay good money for a woman's sentimental scribblings." Mason frowned. "This Blackwell fellow sounds like he might be blind or a fool, possibly both." Despite herself, Pearl felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "He's a respected art dealer. And I'm a respected lawman, but that doesn't mean I'm always right." Mason handed the painting back to her. "Maybe hold on to this one. Sleep on it before you decide." Pearl stared at the canvas, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It represented 3 days of work, of hope, of believing that maybe she could make something of herself beyond being the daughter of a failed prospector, beyond being the woman who sold eggs and milk in town to keep herself fed. "Why do you care?" she asked. Mason shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "My ma used to say that destroying something you created is like cutting off a piece of yourself. Whatever this Blackwell said, these are parts of you. Seems a shame to burn them all without a second thought." Pearl looked at the painting, then back at the fire, The sun had set completely now, leaving them in the flickering orange glow of the flames. One painting won't change anything. Maybe not, Mason agreed, but it's a start. And I've got a nail on my cabin wall that could use something nicer to look at than my wanted posters collection. Pearl's eyes widened. You want to keep it. If you're giving it away, I'd be honored. There was no mockery in his voice, only simple honesty that caught Pearl by surprise. Pearl hesitated, then held out the painting. Take it then. At least someone will see it before it turns to ash and is forgotten. Mason accepted the canvas with careful hands, as though it were made of something far more precious than wood and cloth and paint. Thank you, Miss Riley. Pearl Riley. Miss Riley. He touched the brim of his hat. I'd better get this somewhere safe before your fire decides to claim it after all. As he carefully secured the painting to his saddle, Pearl found herself wondering what sort of man would intervene to save a stranger's art. Marshal Lane, she called as he mounted his horse. What brought you out this way tonight? Mason settled into his saddle, the leather creaking beneath him. Just making my rounds, been reports of cattle rustlers in these parts. He patted his horse's neck. Thunder and I like to keep an eye on the outlying homesteads. Well, thank you for stopping. Pearl wasn't sure why she was thanking him for preventing her from burning all evidence of her failure, or for being the first person in Central City to show genuine interest in her work. My pleasure, Miss Riley. He tipped his hat again. If you decide against burning any more of your paintings, the Founders' Day celebration is coming up next month. They're always looking for local artisans to display their work. Before Pearl could respond, he turned his horse and rode off into the gathering darkness, the rescued painting securely fastened to his saddle. Pearl watched until the night swallowed him completely, then turned back to her fire. The flames had died down somewhat, leaving the charred remains of a dozen canvases smoldering in the pit. She kicked dirt onto the fire, suddenly exhausted. The burning hadn't brought the satisfaction she'd hoped for, only a hollow feeling in her chest and the acrid smell of burnt dreams in her nose. Pearl glanced at the remaining stack of paintings she hadn't yet committed to the flames. After a moment's hesitation, she gathered them up and carried them back inside her cabin. Perhaps she would sleep on it after all. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that seemed to sparkle with possibility. Pearl rose early as was her habit, feeding her small flock of chickens and milking her cow, before loading her wagon with eggs, butter, and the few late vegetables from her garden to sell in town. As she guided her steady old mare toward Central City, Pearl found her thoughts returning to the marshal and their strange encounter. She'd been so caught up in her despair that she hadn't questioned the oddity of the town marshal riding so far out at dusk. Her cabin was a good 3 miles from town, hardly on the regular patrol route. Central City had grown substantially since the gold strike 15 years earlier. While many mining towns boomed and then withered away, Central City had established itself as a more permanent settlement, with brick buildings replacing wooden structures along the main street, and a steady stream of hopeful miners, merchants, and families arriving each month. Pearl guided her wagon past the Grand Central Hotel, with its impressive facade and hitching posts, occupied by fine horses, then past Baxter's General Store, where she sold most of her produce. She finally stopped in front of the Central City Mercantile, where women from the surrounding homesteads often gathered to sell their wares and exchange news. "Morning, Pearl," called Martha Wilson, the mercantile owner's wife, as Pearl entered with her basket of eggs. "You're looking better than the last time I saw you. Did your trip to Denver go well?" Pearl forced a smile. "Not exactly. Mr. Blackwell at the gallery wasn't interested in my work." Martha's face fell. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry to hear that. His loss, if you ask me. Those paintings of yours are just lovely. Thank you, Martha. Pearl placed her basket on the counter. 2 dozen eggs today and 5 pounds of butter. As Martha counted out payment, the bell above the door jangled. Pearl turned to see Marshal Lane entering the store, his tall frame filling the doorway. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. In the daylight, Pearl could see that his eyes weren't simply gray as she'd thought in the firelight, but a striking blue-gray that reminded her of storm clouds. Their eyes met, and recognition flickered in his. "Miss Riley," he nodded politely. "Good morning, Marshal." Pearl felt suddenly self-conscious in her simple calico dress and worn boots, acutely aware of the smudge of dirt that probably still marked her cheek from gathering eggs that morning. Martha looked between them with interest. "You two know each other?" "The Marshal was kind enough to stop by my property last evening," Pearl said, hoping her vague explanation would suffice. "Just doing my rounds," Mason added, approaching the counter. "Mrs. Wilson, I was hoping you might have those nails I ordered." "Just came in yesterday," Martha said brightly, disappearing into the back room. Left alone with the Marshal, Pearl found herself struggling for something to say. Did the painting survive the journey?" A smile broke across Mason's face, transforming his serious features. "It did. Already hung it up, too. Makes my cabin look almost civilized." "I'm glad," Pearl said, and was surprised to find she meant it. The thought of at least one of her paintings finding a home, even if it was just out of pity, brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. Martha returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Here you are, Marshal. Anything else I can help you with today?" "That'll do fine, thank you." He paid for his purchase, then turned back to Pearl. "Miss Riley, I was wondering if I might have a word with you outside." Pearl nodded, curious despite herself. She bid goodbye to Martha, who gave her a knowing look that Pearl chose to ignore, and followed the Marshal out onto the boardwalk. "I've been thinking about your paintings," Mason said without preamble. "The one you gave me, it's special. You have a real gift." Pearl felt her defenses rise. "Marshal Lane, I appreciate what you did last night, but I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," he replied firmly. "I know a thing or two about art, Miss Riley. My mother was an accomplished painter back east before she married my father and moved west." Pearl studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found only earnestness in his steady gaze. "If that's true, then you should understand why I was burning them. There's no place for art out here. People want practical things: food, tools, shelter, not paintings." "That's where you're wrong," Mason said. "Folks need beauty just as much as they need bread, especially in places like this." He gestured to the muddy street, the utilitarian buildings, the mountains rising in the distance. "We're surrounded by God's own masterpiece out here, but sometimes we get so caught up in surviving that we forget to see it. Your paintings remind people to look." Pearl was stunned by his eloquence, by the passion in his voice. "You sound like you've given this some thought." "I have," he admitted. "That's why I wanted to speak with you. There's a lady in Denver, a friend of my mother's, who runs a small gallery. Not as grand as this Blackwell fellow's place, but respectable. She's always looking for new artists to feature." Hope flared in Pearl's chest, bright and dangerous. "Are you suggesting—" "I'd like to show her your work," Mason said. "If you're willing, I'm heading to Denver next week on business. I could take a few of your paintings with me." Pearl's mind raced. Was this another cruel joke, another disappointment waiting to happen? Or was it a genuine opportunity? She studied the Marshal's face, looking for any sign of mockery or deception, but found only sincerity. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You barely know me." Mason shifted his weight, suddenly looking less sure of himself. I believe in supporting talent when I see it. And he hesitated, then continued more quietly, I know what it's like to have dreams that don't quite fit with where life has planted you. Something in his voice resonated with Pearl, striking a chord of recognition. Before she could respond, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of miners had spilled out of the saloon, their raised voices carrying on the morning air. Mason sighed. Duty calls, it seems. Think about my offer, Miss Riley. I'll stop by your place in a few days to hear your decision. He settled his hat back on his head, nodded politely, and strode toward the disturbance with the confident gait of a man accustomed to handling trouble. Pearl watched him go, her mind whirling with possibilities. Another chance to show her work, this time without having to scrape together every penny for the stagecoach fare to Denver. It seemed too good to be true. And yet, as she climbed back into her wagon and headed home, Pearl found herself mentally cataloging the paintings she had left, wondering which ones might best represent her work. Despite herself, despite all her practical misgivings, hope had taken root once more. 3 days passed before Pearl saw Marshal Lane again. She'd spent the time sorting through her remaining paintings, cleaning the ones that showed the most promise, and even beginning a new one, a view of the sunset from her porch, with the mountains silhouetted against the brilliant sky. The very scene that had been unfolding when she decided to burn her work. She was outside, sketching a preliminary outline for another new painting, when the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approached. Pearl set aside her sketchbook and stood, brushing charcoal dust from her apron as Mason Lane rode into view. Miss Riley, he greeted her, dismounting in one fluid motion. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Pearl replied, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, hair escaping its pins, smudges of charcoal on her hands. I was just working on some ideas. Mason's eyes brightened. So you're painting again, Pearl nodded, leading him toward the porch of her small cabin. I've been thinking about your offer. It's very generous. But, Mason prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But I don't understand why you're doing this, Pearl admitted. People don't typically go out of their way to help strangers without expecting something in return. Mason leaned against the porch railing, considering her words. My father used to say that a man's character is measured by what he does when there's nothing in it for him. He shrugged. Maybe I'm trying to measure up. Pearl studied him, noting the way the afternoon sun highlighted the strands of copper in his dark hair, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he spoke. And is that all it is? A test of character? Something shifted in Mason's expression, a flicker of vulnerability quickly masked. Would you believe me if I said I haven't been able to stop thinking about that painting, about the way you see the world? The admission hung between them, unexpectedly intimate. Pearl felt her cheeks warm. I think, she said carefully, that I'd like to accept your offer if it's still open. Mason's smile was like the breaking of dawn across his features. It is. I leave for Denver on Monday. Could have 3 or 4 pieces with me if you're willing. I've selected a few that might be suitable, Pearl admitted. Would you like to see them? I'd be honored. Pearl led him inside her modest cabin. Though small, it was meticulously kept, with simple furnishings that reflected both practicality and care. Against one wall, she had arranged 5 paintings, each one showcasing a different aspect of the landscape around Central City. Mason moved slowly from one to the next, taking his time with each, his expression thoughtful. These are remarkable, he said finally. You capture not just how things look, but how they feel. Pearl watched him anxiously, trying to read his reactions. Do you think they're good enough for your friend's gallery? They're more than good enough, Mason assured her. The question is which ones to take. He pointed to a painting of a mountain stream tumbling over rocks, This one shows your technical skill. Then to another, a view of Central City from above, lights twinkling in the dusk. This one shows your eye for composition. Finally, to a third, a simple scene of wildflowers growing at the edge of a meadow with mountains hazed blue in the distance. And this one shows your heart. Pearl was stunned by his assessment. You really do know something about art. Told you my mother was an artist, Mason said with a slight smile. I grew up surrounded by paintings and the people who loved them. Never had the talent myself, but I learned to appreciate it. And you became a lawman instead, Pearl observed. Life takes unexpected turns. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Pearl felt as though he were seeing straight through to her soul. I think these three would give Mrs. Hollister a good sense of your range. If you're comfortable parting with them for a time. Pearl nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest. I trust you with them. I'll guard them with my life, Mason promised, only half joking. And I'll bring them back safely, along with Mrs. Hollister's honest opinion. She's not one to sugarcoat things, but she's fair. That's all I can ask for. Pearl moved to wrap the paintings for transport. When will you return from Denver? Should be gone about a week, if all goes smoothly. Mason watched as she carefully packaged each canvas. I'm testifying at a trial for a man I arrested last month. Once that's done, I'll visit Mrs. Hollister and then head back. Pearl handed him the wrapped paintings, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Safe travels then, Marshal. Mason, he corrected gently. When I'm not wearing the badge, I'm just Mason. Pearl smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. Safe travels, Mason. After he left, Pearl stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared from view, the wrapped paintings secured to his saddle. She felt strangely lighter, as though she'd handed over more than just her art. She'd given him a piece of her hope as well, entrusting it to his care. The next week passed with excruciating slowness. Pearl threw herself into her work, both the practical tasks of maintaining her small homestead and the creative outlet of painting. She found herself looking at the landscape with fresh eyes, noticing details she had overlooked before, the particular way light filtered through pine branches, the subtle gradations of color in a distant hillside, the delicate structure of a columbine blossom. Each day, she checked the road for signs of a returning rider, though she knew it was too soon. Each evening, she added details to a new painting, a view of the valley at sunset, with a lone rider on horseback silhouetted against the golden light. She told herself it wasn't specifically Mason she was painting, just a generic figure to give scale to the landscape. But she took particular care with the set of his shoulders, the easy grace of his seat in the saddle. In town, Pearl found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations. Word had spread that Marshal Lane had taken an interest in her paintings, and perhaps in Pearl herself. Martha Wilson was particularly persistent in her questioning. Such a fine man, our Marshal, she commented as Pearl delivered eggs the following Saturday. Came from back east originally, you know. Has education and manners, not like some of these rough types. Been here 3 years now, and not once has he shown particular interest in any of the eligible ladies in town. Her knowing look made Pearl's cheeks burn. He's simply being kind, Martha, Pearl insisted. He believes my paintings might find appreciation in Denver, that's all. MMHMM, Martha hummed, unconvinced. And I suppose that's why he was asking all about you before he left, wanting to know how long you've been on your own, whether you had family nearby. Pearl's heart skipped a beat. He asked about me. Martha's smile was triumphant. Thought that might interest you. Yes, indeed, wanted to know all about Miss Pearl Riley. I told him you've been managing that homestead by yourself since your pa passed 2 years back, and doing a fine job of it too. Pearl wasn't sure how to feel about this revelation. Was Mason's interest in her art merely a pretext for personal curiosity? The thought both unsettled and excited her. "When is the Marshal expected back?" Pearl asked, trying to sound casual. "Should be any day now, according to Deputy Collins." Martha leaned closer. "Between you and me, I think half the town is waiting to see if he comes straight to your place when he returns." Pearl groaned inwardly. Small town life had its advantages, but privacy certainly wasn't one of them. 9 days after Mason had departed for Denver, Pearl was in her garden harvesting the last of her root vegetables before the first hard frost when she heard approaching hoofbeats. She straightened, pushing hair from her face, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. Mason looked travel-worn as he dismounted, dust clinging to his clothes and a weariness in his stance that hadn't been there before. But his face brightened when he saw Pearl, and he removed his hat as he approached. "Miss Riley," he greeted her. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Pearl said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're back sooner than expected. Trial ended quickly. The evidence was pretty clear-cut." Mason glanced toward his saddlebags. "I have your paintings." Pearl's mouth went dry, and I think we should sit down to discuss it." His expression gave nothing away. Pearl led him to the small table and chairs on her porch, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Mrs. Hollister hated her work? Was Mason trying to find a gentle way to let her down? Mason placed the wrapped paintings carefully on the table, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This is for you, from Mrs. Hollister." With trembling fingers, Pearl opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As she read, her eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. "She wants to display my work." Pearl looked up at Mason in disbelief. "In her gallery, in Denver." Mason's face broke into a wide smile. "Not only that, she sold one already to a banker from New York who was visiting. Paid $50 for it, which Mrs. Hollister says is a very respectable sum for an unknown artist." Pearl felt dizzy. $50 was nearly half of what she earned in a year from her eggs and butter. "I don't understand." "Mr. Blackwell said." "Mr. Blackwell is an idiot," Mason said flatly. "Or he has terrible taste. Either way, Mrs. Hollister disagrees with him completely. She thinks you have significant talent and a unique perspective." He nodded toward the letter. "She's offering to display more of your work, if you're willing to send it. And she included payment for the painting she sold." Pearl looked back at the letter, and indeed, there was a bank draft for $40, Mrs. Hollister's commission having been $10. It was more money than Pearl had seen at once in years. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll keep painting," Mason suggested, his voice gentle. "Say you'll let the world see how you view it." Pearl looked up at him, seeing the genuine pleasure in his eyes at delivering this news. "Why did you do this for me, truly?" Mason was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "When I saw you burning those paintings, it felt like watching someone give up on themselves. I couldn't bear it." He met her gaze directly. "I've seen too many people out here lose sight of everything but survival. They forget there's beauty in the world, forget to look for it. Your paintings reminded me to look." Pearl felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you seems inadequate." "There is one thing you could do to thank me," Mason said, a hint of nervousness entering his voice. "Name it. Have dinner with me. Not here in town, at the Grand Central Hotel. They have a proper dining room with tablecloths and everything." He smiled self-deprecatingly. "I clean up pretty well when the occasion calls for it." Pearl was momentarily speechless. The Grand Central was the finest establishment in Central City, where wealthy mine owners and visiting dignitaries dined. "People would talk," she said finally. "People already are talking," Mason pointed out. Might as well give them something worth talking about. Pearl laughed, surprised by his boldness. Martha Wilson mentioned you'd been asking about me. Mason had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I wanted to know more about the woman behind the paintings. And what did you learn? That you're as remarkable as your art. His sincerity was disarming. So, will you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? Pearl looked at him, this man who had saved not just her painting but perhaps her dreams as well, and found herself nodding. Yes, I'd like that very much. The smile that lit Mason's face was worth all the gossip their dinner would undoubtedly generate. As he took his leave, promising to call for her at 6 the following evening, Pearl felt as though she were standing on the edge of something new and unexpected, a blank canvas waiting for the first stroke of color. The news of Pearl's success spread quickly through Central City. By the time she arrived in town the next morning to purchase fabric for a dinner dress, it seemed everyone knew that the reclusive Miss Riley was not only a talented artist recognized in Denver, but was also dining with Marshal Lane at the Grand Central that very evening. "I always knew you had a gift," Martha Wilson declared as she helped Pearl select a length of blue merino wool that matched her eyes. "And didn't I tell you the Marshal was sweet on you? A woman can tell these things." Pearl tried to downplay both her artistic success and the significance of the dinner, but Martha would have none of it. "It's been an age since we've had a proper romance in this town," she declared. "Let us enjoy it." By the time 6 o'clock arrived, Pearl had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation. She'd sewn frantically all day to complete her new dress, a simple but elegant creation with a fitted bodice and graceful skirt. She'd arranged her hair in a more sophisticated style than her usual practical bun, allowing golden brown curls to frame her face. When Mason arrived, Pearl almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the dusty lawman in practical leathers. In his place stood a gentleman in a well-tailored dark suit, white shirt, and silk cravat. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. Only his eyes remained the same, that striking blue-gray that reminded Pearl of approaching storms. "Miss Riley," he said, his voice betraying his own nervousness. "You look beautiful." Pearl felt heat rise to her cheeks. "As do you. Handsome, I mean." She winced at her awkwardness. Mason's smile eased the tension. "I borrowed the suit from Judge Parker. He's about my size, and his wife insisted I couldn't take you to dinner looking like I'd just ridden in from the trail." The image of the formidable Mrs. Parker fussing over Mason's appearance made Pearl laugh. "It seems the entire town is invested in our dinner." "So it seems." Mason offered his arm. "Shall we give them something to talk about?" The Grand Central Hotel's dining room was as opulent as Central City could manage: crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and a small ensemble playing gentle music in the corner. Heads turned as Mason escorted Pearl to a table near the window, and whispers followed in their wake. "I feel like I'm on display," Pearl murmured as they were seated. "Focus on me," Mason suggested. "Pretend no one else is here." It was surprisingly easy to follow his advice. As they ordered and began to eat, conversation flowed naturally between them. Mason told her about growing up in Boston, the son of a judge and an artist, and how the call of adventure had drawn him west after the war. "I fought for the Union," he explained. "Came home different, like many did. The city felt too confining after that, too full of ghosts. I needed open spaces and a fresh start." Pearl understood completely. "My father brought us west when I was 12, chasing silver. He never found his fortune, but he loved it here until the day he died." "And you?" Mason asked. "Do you love it here?" Pearl considered the question. "I love the land, the mountains, the light, the wildness of it all, the town." She shrugged. "It's been harder to find my place here." A woman alone is always slightly suspect, especially one who paints instead of focusing solely on finding a husband. Yet you stayed. It's home, Pearl said simply. And there's nowhere else I'd rather paint, but I've wondered if I might need to leave to find people who understand my work. Perhaps not anymore, Mason pointed out. With Mrs. Hollister representing your work in Denver, you could stay here and still reach an audience. Their conversation continued through dinner and dessert, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen, and dreams they still harbored. Pearl discovered that beneath Mason's stoic lawman exterior was a thoughtful, well-read man with a dry wit and genuine curiosity about the world. As the evening drew to a close, Mason escorted Pearl back to where his horse waited to take her home. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black silk. "I've had a wonderful time," Pearl said as they walked, acutely aware of his hand at the small of her back. "As have I," Mason replied. "I'd like to do this again, often if you're willing." Pearl looked up at him, at the earnest expression on his face illuminated by the moon and the light spilling from shop windows. "I'd like that too." Mason helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her for the ride back to her cabin. Pearl was intensely conscious of his arms around her as he held the reins, of the solid warmth of his chest against her back. They rode in comfortable silence, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the vast starry sky creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. At her cabin, Mason helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Pearl," he said, her name sounding like a caress in his deep voice. "Yes," she looked up at him, heart pounding. "I'd very much like to kiss you, if that would be acceptable." Pearl smiled at his formal request. "It would be most acceptable." Mason leaned down, one hand gently cupping her cheek, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that started tender but quickly deepened as Pearl responded. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster, and Mason's eyes had darkened to the color of twilight. "Good night, Pearl," he murmured. "Good night, Mason." Pearl touched her fingers to her lips as she watched him ride away, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, as though she had been looking at a painting from one angle for years, only to discover that, from a different perspective, it told an entirely new story. Over the following weeks, Pearl and Mason's courtship became the favorite topic of conversation in Central City. They dined together regularly, attended church side by side on Sundays, and were often seen riding together through the countryside, ostensibly so Pearl could find new landscapes to paint, though few in town believed that was their only purpose. Pearl found herself painting with renewed vigor and vision. With Mrs. Hollister's encouragement and Mason's unwavering support, she sent more work to Denver, where it continued to sell to appreciative buyers. The income allowed her to purchase better materials, and even hire a local boy to help with the heavier chores around her homestead. As autumn deepened toward winter, Pearl was working on a new series of paintings depicting the changing seasons in the mountains when Mason arrived one evening, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Pearl asked, immediately concerned. "Has something happened?" Mason paced the small confines of her cabin. "I've been offered a position. U.S. Marshal for the Colorado Territory." Pearl's heart sank. "You'd have to leave Central City." "I'd be based in Denver," he confirmed. "It's a significant advancement, more responsibility, better pay." "It's a wonderful opportunity," Pearl said, trying to keep the dismay from her voice. "You deserve it." Mason stopped pacing and turned to face her. "I told them I needed time to consider it." "Why, it seems like exactly what you've worked for." "Because of you," Mason said simply. "Because what's growing between us matters more to me than any badge or title." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "I won't be the reason you turn down this position." What if there were another option? Mason took her hands in his. What if you came with me? Pearl stared at him. To Denver. As my wife. Mason dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Pearl, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I love your spirit, your talent, your heart. I love the way you see beauty where others see only wilderness. I love you and I want to build a life with you wherever that may be. Tears spilled freely down Pearl's cheeks now. Mason, we could have a good life in Denver, he continued earnestly. You'd be closer to the gallery, to other artists. There are schools there for when we have children. And I'd be doing work I believe in. He squeezed her hands. But if you want to stay here, I'll turn down the position. Central City needs a marshal too. Pearl was overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his voice, by the future he was offering. You'd give up this opportunity for me? In a heartbeat, he said without hesitation. But I'm hoping I won't have to choose, that we can build our future together. Pearl thought of her small cabin, of the land she'd come to love, of the community that had finally begun to accept her as an artist as well as a woman. And then she thought of Denver with its growing cultural scene, its opportunities, and most importantly, a life there with Mason. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, I'll marry you, Mason Lane. And yes, we'll go to Denver together. Mason's face lit with joy as he rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond. It was my mother's. As he slipped it onto her finger, Pearl felt a profound sense of rightness, as though all the seemingly random brushstrokes of her life were finally revealing their true pattern. We'll need to be married before we move, Mason said, already planning. And find someone to buy your homestead unless you want to keep it. Pearl thought about it. Perhaps we could keep it as a summer place. Somewhere to come when the city grows too crowded, somewhere I can still paint these mountains. I like that idea, Mason agreed, a foot in both worlds. As they discussed their plans, Pearl's gaze fell on the first painting she'd begun after meeting Mason, the one of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset. She'd completed it weeks ago, but had kept it for herself, unwilling to part with the image that had come to symbolize how he'd ridden into her life and changed everything. I have something for you, she said, moving to where the painting hung on her wall. She took it down and handed it to him. To remind you of where we began. Mason studied the painting, recognition dawning in his eyes as he realized it was him, or at least a representation of him, riding across the landscape she loved so well. It's perfect, he said softly, and fitting. You saved one of your paintings from the fire that night, and now you've given me another. Bookends to our beginning. Pearl smiled at the symmetry of it. From fire to future. I like that, Mason said, setting the painting carefully aside and drawing her back into his arms. From fire to future. Their wedding took place on a crisp December day, with the mountains dusted in the first snows of winter. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the small church to overflowing. Martha Wilson wept openly through the ceremony, declaring it the most romantic thing to happen in Central City since its founding. Pearl wore a gown of ivory silk ordered specially from Denver, with sprigs of pine and winter berries in her hair instead of a veil. Mason, resplendent in his new U.S. Marshal uniform, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Judge Parker's arm, the judge having volunteered to give her away in her father's absence. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to cherish and support each other through whatever life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason's kiss was both tender and promising, drawing cheers and a few good-natured jests from the assembled townsfolk. The celebration afterward spilled from the church hall into the Grand Central Hotel and even onto the streets, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. Pearl and Mason slipped away as the stars emerged, riding to her cabin, their cabin now for their first night as husband and wife. In the soft glow of lamplight, they discovered each other anew, their bodies speaking what words could not fully express. Later, as they lay entwined beneath quilts against the winter chill, Mason traced patterns on Pearl's bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. Pearl nodded, nestling closer to him. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. When we move to Denver," Mason said thoughtfully, "I want to find a house with a room just for your painting, north-facing windows for the best light." Pearl smiled against his chest. "You've been talking to Mrs. Hollister about studio requirements, haven't you?" "Might have asked a few questions," Mason admitted. "I want you to have everything you need to continue your work." "I already have what I need most," Pearl said, raising herself on one elbow to look at him. "Someone who believes in me, even when I don't believe in myself." Mason pulled her down for another kiss. Always. Spring arrived with new beginnings. Pearl and Mason moved to Denver, settling into a comfortable home not far from the center of the growing city. As promised, their house included a bright room with north-facing windows that became Pearl's studio. The walls soon filled with works-in-progress landscapes from memory, and from their frequent trips back to their cabin in the mountains, as well as new scenes from the bustling city and its surroundings. Mason took to his new position with characteristic dedication and integrity, earning the respect of his fellow lawmen and the citizens he served. Pearl's reputation as an artist grew steadily, with Mrs. Hollister arranging exhibitions that drew increasing attention and acclaim. During their second summer in Denver, Pearl made a discovery that added yet another dimension to their happiness. On a warm June evening, as they sat on the porch of their mountain cabin enjoying the sunset, Pearl took Mason's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said, watching his face with nervous anticipation. Mason's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to pure joy in the span of seconds. "A baby? You're certain?" Pearl nodded, her own happiness mirrored in his eyes. "Dr. Matthews confirmed it yesterday. Around Christmas time, he thinks." Mason gathered her into his arms, laughing and crying at once. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of awe. "Our child." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that no artist could fully capture, Pearl thought about the journey that had brought them here from a desperate night of burning canvases to this perfect moment of creation and possibility. Their son, Thomas, was born on a snowy December night, almost exactly 2 years after their wedding. He had his father's storm-colored eyes and his mother's artistic temperament, showing an early fascination with colors and shapes that made both parents smile knowingly at each other. As the years passed, Pearl and Mason's family grew. A daughter, Lily, joined them 3 years after Thomas, followed by another son, James, 2 years later. Their Denver home expanded to accommodate their growing family, and their mountain cabin became a beloved retreat where summers were spent exploring, painting, and building memories. Pearl's artistic career flourished alongside her family life. Her paintings hung in galleries across the country, and even a few in Europe. She became known for her ability to capture the essence of the American West, not just its physical grandeur, but the feeling of possibility and freedom it inspired. Critics praised her authentic vision and remarkable sensitivity to light and atmosphere. Mason's career advanced as well. He eventually became Chief U.S. Marshal for the region, a position that allowed him to implement the fair-minded approach to law enforcement he had always believed in. Though the work sometimes took him away from home, he always returned with stories and small gifts for the children, and with the same look of wonder when he gazed at Pearl. They never forgot where their story began. In their Denver home, in a place of honor above the fireplace, hung the painting Mason had rescued that night. Pearl's view of Central City nestled in the mountains. Beside it hung the painting she had given him of the lone rider at sunset. Together, they told the story of their beginning of art nearly lost to fire, and the man who had seen its value. On the 20th anniversary of that fateful night, Mason surprised Pearl with a special gift, a journal bound in soft leather, its pages filled with his neat handwriting. As she read, Pearl realized he had recorded their story, beginning with "The night I found Pearl Riley burning her paintings behind her cabin. I knew I was witnessing something tragic, the destruction of beauty by the very hand that created it." Pearl looked up from the journal, tears in her eyes. "You've been writing our story all these years," Mason nodded, a hint of self-consciousness in his smile. "I wanted to preserve it, like your paintings preserve the landscapes we love, for the children and maybe someday for their children." That evening, surrounded by the family they had built together, Pearl reflected on how differently her life might have unfolded if Mason hadn't ridden by her cabin that night, if he hadn't saved that one painting from the fire. It seemed such a small moment to have altered the course of two lives so completely. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, finding her alone on the porch after the children had gone to bed. Pearl leaned into his embrace, comfortable in the love that had only deepened over 20 years. "About how close I came to letting despair win that night. How easily I might have burned every painting and given up on art entirely." Mason's arms tightened around her. "I think you would have found your way back to it eventually. Your talent was too strong to stay buried forever." "Perhaps," Pearl conceded, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out." She turned in his arms to face him, studying the beloved features that had aged so gracefully, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of laughter, the touches of silver at his temples that matched the badge he still wore with honor. "Thank you for saving more than just a painting that night." "Thank you for painting our life with such beauty," Mason replied, his voice husky with emotion. "Every day has been a masterpiece." As stars appeared in the darkening sky above Denver, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning in the mountains, Pearl and Mason sealed their gratitude with a kiss that held the memory of their first and the promise of countless more to come. And in galleries across America, Pearl Riley Lane's paintings continue to tell the story of the West as she had experienced it, a place of challenge and hardship, yes, but also of extraordinary beauty and boundless possibility. Of fire and destruction, but also of rescue and renewal. Of endings transformed into beginnings. Of love that, like art, could survive the flames and emerge more precious for having been saved.